The scent of honeysuckle, thick and sweet, on the humid air, still brought Evelyn back. Not to the present, not to the quiet, empty house where dust motes danced in the afternoon sun, but to another summer, decades ago, when the world had been vibrant with promise, and the air thrummed with a different kind of anticipation. It was a cruel trick of memory, how a simple fragrance could unlock a vault of pain, a vault she had tried for so long to keep sealed. That day, the air had been alive with the buzz of 1,000 cicadas and the excited chatter of 100 graduating seniors. The small town of Havenwood, nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills, had never seen a day quite like it. Every porch was draped in streamers. Every car horn seemed to honk a celebratory tune. It was June 1998, and the future for everyone felt boundless. For Evelyn, it was embodied in her daughter Sarah. Sarah. All sunshine and possibility had practically floated across the makeshift stage in the town square, her bright red gown, a beacon against the ancient oak trees. Her smile, wide and genuine, had caught the afternoon light, a flash of pure, unadulterated joy. Evelyn remembered the way Sarah's auburn hair, usually a wild cascade, had been tamed into a neat braid beneath her mortarboard, a concession to the formality of the day that Sarah had grumbled about for weeks. But now, with her diploma clutched in her hand, all grumbling was forgotten. She was free. She was ready. She was going to change the world. Evelyn had felt a surge of pride so potent it brought tears to her eyes, tears that in retrospect felt like a grim portent of the deluge to come. After the ceremony, the town had erupted into a cacophony of celebration. Families spilled into the park, picnic blankets spread across the freshly cut grass, laughter echoing off the surrounding hills. Sarah, ever the social butterfly, had flitted from group to group, hugging friends, posing for photos, her energy infectious. Evelyn watched her, a contented smile on her face, as Sarah promised to meet her by the old stone fountain in 20 minutes, just enough time to say her final goodbyes to her classmates before heading home for the family dinner. "Don't forget my lucky charm," Mom Sarah had called out, gesturing to the small silver locket Evelyn always wore, a family heirloom Sarah had borrowed for the ceremony. Evelyn had smiled a silent promise. 20 minutes turned into 30, 30 into 45. The crowd began to thin, the celebratory shouts fading into a gentle hum. Evelyn remained by the fountain, a growing unease coiling in her stomach. It wasn't panic, not yet, just a subtle shift in the air, a quiet discord in the symphony of the afternoon. She told herself Sarah was just caught up, that she'd be there any minute. But the sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the park, and the hum of cicadas seemed to grow louder, more insistent, filling the silence where Sarah's laughter should have been. Evelyn walked the perimeter of the park, her eyes scanning every face, every lingering group. She called Sarah's name softly at first, then with a rising urgency that caught the attention of a few remaining parents. They offered sympathetic glances, a shrug, a suggestion that Sarah had probably just gone on ahead. But Evelyn knew her daughter. Sarah wouldn't leave without her locket. She wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. The park emptied. The last rays of sunlight bled from the sky, painting the clouds in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. The air grew cooler, the honeysuckle scent now tinged with the dampness of approaching night. Evelyn stood alone by the fountain, the silence pressing in on her heavy and suffocating. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the encroaching darkness. She pulled the silver locket from around her neck its cool metal a stark contrast to the sudden chill that had settled deep in her bones. Then her gaze fell upon it. Lying on the damp grass near the edge of the fountain's basin was a single bright red graduation tassel. It was Sarah's. Evelyn knew it instantly, not just by the color, but by the small, almost invisible fray in one of its silken threads, a detail only a mother would notice. It lay there perfectly still, a splash of defiant color against the darkening green. But it wasn't just that it was there. It was how it was there. Not dropped carelessly, but almost placed. And it was far from where Sarah had last been seen, too far for it to have simply fallen. A cold dread, sharper than any fear she had known, began to spread through Evelyn's veins. Something was wrong, terribly, irrevocably wrong. The crickets began their nightly chorus, a mournful, rhythmic sound that would haunt Evelyn for years to come. She knelt, her fingers trembling as she reached for the tassel, its silken threads cool and damp beneath her touch. As she picked it up, a faint metallic glint caught her eye, almost hidden beneath the tassel. It was a small silver charm shaped like a tiny open book. It wasn't hers. It wasn't Sarah's. And it was unlike anything Evelyn had ever seen before. The night swallowed Havenwood whole, and with it, Sarah. The silver charm, shaped like a tiny open book, felt impossibly heavy in Evelyn's palm. It was cold, alien, a stark contrast to the warmth of Sarah's tassel. The chill that had settled in her bones now spread an icy tendril of fear, reaching for her heart. She stood there alone in the darkening park, the crickets' chorus no longer mournful, but mocking, a relentless reminder of the silence where her daughter's voice should have been. The celebration had curdled into a nightmare. Her first calls were frantic, breathless whispers into the phone, punctuated by rising hysteria. Her husband, David, had been at his brother's house celebrating with the wider family, and his initial calm, reassuring tones quickly fractured as Evelyn's disjointed words painted a picture of impossible absence. "She's not here, David. She's just gone." The words felt hollow, inadequate to describe the gaping void that had swallowed their daughter. He was there in minutes, his face a mask of disbelief, then dawning terror. Together, they retraced Evelyn's steps, calling Sarah's name, their voices growing hoarse, their hope dwindling with each unanswered echo. The Havenwood Police Department was small, accustomed to petty theft and teenage mischief, not vanishing acts on graduation day. Officer Miller, a man whose face was etched with the weariness of small-town life, arrived first. He listened patiently, his gaze sweeping over the empty park. The discarded picnic blankets, the lone red tassel clutched in Evelyn's hand. He asked the standard questions, his voice gentle but firm. Had Sarah been upset? Had she argued with anyone? Did she have a boyfriend they didn't know about? Evelyn shook her head, each denial a fresh stab of pain. Sarah was happy. Sarah was excited. Sarah was going to college in the fall. This wasn't Sarah. The initial search was a blur of flashing lights and hushed voices. More officers arrived, then volunteers, their faces grim under the beam of flashlights. They fanned out across the park, combing the bushes, peering into the shadows of the ancient oaks. Dogs were brought in, their barks sharp and urgent in the night, but they found nothing. No scent, no trail, just the damp earth and the lingering sweetness of honeysuckle. The town, once alive with celebration, now held its breath, a collective gasp of disbelief and growing dread. Evelyn watched from the sidelines, her body numb, her mind replaying every moment of the day, searching for a sign, a clue, anything she might have missed. The silver charm still clutched in her hand felt like a burning coal, a foreign object in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. As dawn broke, painting the sky in a sickly gray, the official narrative began to take shape. Officer Miller, his voice softer now, almost apologetic, suggested the unthinkable. Sometimes kids, they just want to get away. Graduation, it's a big moment, a lot of pressure. He spoke of runaways, of teenagers seeking independence, of the allure of the open road. The words hung in the air heavy with unspoken judgment, a convenient explanation for an inconvenient truth. Evelyn felt a surge of cold fury. Sarah wouldn't run away. She insisted, her voice raw. Not without her locket. Not without saying goodbye. Not without her future. But the seed of doubt had been planted not just in the minds of the authorities, but in the hushed whispers of the town. People wanted an explanation, a tidy box to put their fear in. And run away was the easiest fit. David, exhausted and pale, tried to reason with her to accept the possibility, however remote. Maybe she just needed space, Ev. Maybe she'll call. But Evelyn knew. She felt it in her bones, a deep primal certainty that this was not a choice Sarah had made. This was something else, something darker. Days bled into weeks. The search continued, though, with diminishing intensity. Flyers with Sarah's smiling face, her graduation photo, appeared on every lamppost, every storefront window in Havenwood and beyond. The phone rang constantly, but it was never Sarah. It was well-meaning neighbors, distant relatives, or reporters, their voices tinged with a morbid curiosity that made Evelyn's skin crawl. Each call, each sympathetic glance, each unanswered question chipped away at her, leaving her feeling hollowed out, a ghost in her own life. One afternoon, a week after Sarah vanished, Evelyn found herself in Sarah's room, a sanctuary that now felt like a tomb. The air was still heavy with the scent of Sarah's favorite lavender sachet. Her bed was neatly made, her textbooks stacked on her desk, a half-finished novel lying open on her nightstand. Everything was exactly as Sarah had left it, a snapshot of a life abruptly paused. Evelyn ran her hand over the smooth, cool surface of the wooden desk, her fingers tracing the faint indentations left by Sarah's pen. Then her gaze fell on Sarah's small wooden jewelry box. It was open, a few tangled necklaces spilling out. Sarah was meticulous about her jewelry. She never left it in a mess. And then Evelyn noticed it. The small silver charm bracelet Sarah had worn every day since she was 10, a gift from her grandmother, was missing. Not just missing from the box, but entirely absent from the room. Sarah never took it off. Not for swimming, not for sports, not even for bed. It was a part of her. Evelyn picked up the jewelry box, her brow furrowed. She remembered Sarah wearing it at the graduation ceremony, the tiny charms glinting as she walked across the stage. But if she had run away, why would she leave behind her most cherished possession? And if she hadn't, where was it? The police had searched the room, of course, but they hadn't noticed. It was a small detail easily overlooked, but to Evelyn it screamed. It was a silent contradiction to the easy narrative of a runaway, a whisper of something deeper, something far more sinister that had taken root in the heart of Havenwood. The charm Evelyn had found by the fountain, the tiny open book, still sat on her own nightstand, a stark, unsettling counterpoint to the missing bracelet. She couldn't shake the feeling that the two were connected, two pieces of a puzzle she was desperate to solve, even as the world around her seemed content to let Sarah fade into the quiet tragedy of a girl who simply disappeared. 25 years, 25 years of mornings that felt like echoes of the same empty day. 25 years of the honeysuckle blooming and fading its sweetness, now a bitter reminder. Evelyn still lived in the same house in Havenwood, though the vibrant colors of Sarah's childhood had long since muted to shades of gray. The town, too, had changed, its once bustling square now quieter, many of the old storefronts boarded up their windows, reflecting only the passing clouds. Life had moved on, as it always does, but for Evelyn, time had fractured, leaving her perpetually tethered to June 1998, to the last glimpse of a red graduation gown and a daughter's radiant smile. She had tried, in those early years, to find a new rhythm, a way to exist without the constant gnawing ache. She'd volunteered at the local library, tending to the quiet stacks, the hushed whispers of turning pages, a balm to her frayed nerves. She'd taken up gardening, coaxing life from the soil, a stark contrast to the barren landscape of her own hope. David, her husband, had retreated into himself, a silent grieving shadow, and their shared sorrow had paradoxically driven a wedge between them two solitary islands adrift in a sea of unspoken pain. The official police file on Sarah's disappearance remained open, a thin folder gathering dust in a forgotten cabinet marked "Runaway," unresolved. Every few years, a new detective would call a fresh voice, asking the same old questions, stirring the ashes of a cold case only to find no new embers. Evelyn would answer her voice flat, devoid of the raw emotion that had once fueled her desperate pleas. She had learned to live with the silence, to carry the weight of the unknown, a heavy shroud that never quite lifted. It was a Tuesday a day, like any other overcast, and still. Evelyn was finally tackling the attic, a task she'd put off for years. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light filtering through the grimy window, illuminating forgotten relics of a life that felt both intimately hers and impossibly distant. Old Christmas decorations, boxes of faded photographs, David's fishing gear from a decade ago. Each item was a small, quiet memory, a whisper from the past. She worked methodically, her movements slow and deliberate, her mind drifting. She found Sarah's old art supplies, a half-finished canvas, still propped on a miniature easel, a vibrant landscape of Havenwood's rolling hills, forever incomplete. A pang, sharp and familiar, pierced her. Then, tucked away beneath a pile of old blankets, she found a box marked "Sarah, School." Her breath hitched. She hadn't opened this box since the first year after Sarah vanished, when every item had felt like a fresh wound. Now, a quarter-century later, she felt a strange, detached curiosity. She lifted the lid, revealing a jumble of school papers, old report cards, and a stack of yearbooks. Sarah's yearbooks. Evelyn picked up the one from Sarah's senior year, the one from 1998. The cover, once glossy, was now dull, the gold lettering of Havenwood High. Class of '98 slightly tarnished. She flipped through the pages, her fingers tracing the faces of teenagers, now grown their youthful smiles, frozen in time. There was Sarah's class photo, her bright eyes sparkling, her arm linked with her best friend Emily. Evelyn lingered there, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, before the familiar ache returned. She turned the page, then another, her gaze sweeping over the rows of faces, the candid shots of school dances and football games. It was a ritual she had performed countless times in the early years, searching for some hidden message, some clue she might have missed. But this time, her eyes snagged on something. A small black and white photo on a page dedicated to the school's drama club. It was a group shot, a dozen teenagers crammed together, some mugging, for the camera, others looking shy. And there, in the back row, partially obscured by another student's head, was a face. A face Evelyn knew. A face that didn't belong. It was a boy, perhaps a year or two older than Sarah, with dark, intense eyes and a faint, almost imperceptible scar above his left eyebrow. He wasn't smiling. He was looking directly at the camera, a strange, unsettling intensity in his gaze. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She knew him. Not well, not intimately, but she knew him. He was the son of one of the town's oldest families, a quiet, almost reclusive boy who had graduated a year or two before Sarah. His name was Thomas Miller, not Officer Miller, but his nephew. Thomas had moved away right after high school or so, everyone said. He'd gone off to college, then disappeared from Havenwood's collective memory. But here he was, in Sarah's yearbook. Evelyn stared at the photo, her mind racing, trying to place him, to remember any interaction Sarah might have had with him. Nothing. Sarah had barely known him. He was just Thomas Miller. And yet his presence in this particular photo, on this particular page, felt wrong. It was a small, almost insignificant detail, easily dismissed by anyone else. But Evelyn had spent 25 years dissecting every fragment of that day, every memory, every inconsistency. And this was an inconsistency. A familiar face in an unexpected place, stirring a dormant unease. Her hand trembled as she brought the yearbook closer, her thumb brushing against the grainy image. The silence of the attic, once comforting, now felt oppressive, filled with the sudden frantic beating of her own heart. Why was Thomas Miller in Sarah's yearbook? Why did his gaze feel so unsettling? And what, if anything, did it have to do with a red graduation tassel, a missing silver charm bracelet, and a daughter who had vanished into thin air on the most hopeful day of her life? The questions long buried clawed their way back to the surface, demanding answers she wasn't sure she was ready to find. The grainy black and white photograph in the Havenwood High yearbook felt like a portal, a sudden jarring rip in the fabric of Evelyn's carefully constructed present. Thomas Miller. The name echoed in her mind, a forgotten whisper from a past she thought she had meticulously catalogued. He was a ghost from the periphery of her memory, a quiet boy from a family deeply rooted in the town's history, a family that had always seemed beyond reproach. Yet here he was, his dark, intense eyes staring out from the page, an unsettling presence in Sarah's world. Evelyn carried the yearbook downstairs, the weight of it in her hands, feeling heavier than its paper and cardboard. She laid it on the kitchen table, the same table where Sarah had done her homework, where they had shared countless meals, where the silence now stretched vast and echoing. She traced Thomas Miller's face with a trembling finger, trying to conjure a memory, any memory of him interacting with Sarah. Had they ever spoken, shared a class, attended the same school event? Nothing. Sarah had been vibrant, outgoing, a magnet for friends. Thomas had been a shadow. He was the kind of boy who blended into the background, easily forgotten once he left the frame. But he hadn't been forgotten by this yearbook. And now, he wouldn't be forgotten by Evelyn. The discovery ignited a spark in Evelyn that had been dormant for decades. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was a desperate, almost terrifying surge of purpose, a feeling that after 25 years of treading water in a sea of grief, she had finally found a current. The red tassel, the missing bracelet, these had been whispers in the dark. This was a face, a name, a tangible thread to pull. The emotional connection to Sarah, which had always been a raw, open wound, now throbbed with a renewed, agonizing intensity. Every unanswered question, every sleepless night, every tear shed over a ghost of a memory coalesced around this single unsettling image. It was as if Sarah herself, from beyond the veil of silence, was pointing a finger, whispering a name. The official story, the one Havenwood had clung to for comfort, was that Thomas Miller had left town immediately after graduating, heading off to a distant college, then disappearing into the vast anonymity of the American landscape. A clean break, a simple, unremarkable departure. But his presence in Sarah's yearbook, a year after he supposedly left, was a glaring contradiction. It was a subtle tear in the fabric of that convenient narrative, a hint that the story everyone believed was at best incomplete, and at worst, a carefully constructed lie. Why would he be in a photo from Sarah's senior year if he had already moved away? The question gnawed at Evelyn, a relentless, insistent hum in her mind. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but for Evelyn, it was a chasm. She knew instinctively that she couldn't approach Officer Miller, now retired, and living a quiet life on the outskirts of town. He had been kind in his way, but he had also been the one to close the book on Sarah, to label her a runaway. He wouldn't see the significance of a faded yearbook photo. He would see a grieving mother clinging to straws. Evelyn needed someone else, someone who understood the quiet currents beneath the surface of Havenwood, someone who wouldn't dismiss her renewed urgency as mere delusion. Her thoughts turned to Martha Jenkins, a retired local journalist who had once written for the Havenwood Gazette. Martha had been a tenacious reporter known for her sharp mind and her refusal to let a story die. She had covered Sarah's disappearance extensively in the early days, her articles filled with a quiet empathy that Evelyn had always appreciated. Martha had been one of the few who had never quite believed the runaway theory. Evelyn found her number tucked away in an old address book, and with a deep, shaky breath, she dialed. Martha's voice, when she answered, was raspy with age, but still held a spark of its former tenacity. Evelyn explained her words, tumbling out in a rush. The story of the attic, the yearbook, Thomas Miller's face. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence that made Evelyn's heart pound. Then Martha spoke, her voice low. "Thomas Miller, you say, that's interesting, Evelyn. Very interesting." They met the next day at Martha's cluttered home, a small cottage overflowing with stacks of old newspapers, dusty books, and the faint scent of stale coffee. Evelyn laid the yearbook open on the table, pointing to Thomas Miller's face. Martha peered at it through thick-rimmed glasses, her brow furrowed in concentration. He was a quiet one, Martha mused, her finger tapping the photo. Kept to himself. His family was private. Very private. Martha pulled out a thick yellowed file labeled Carrington Sarah, 1998. It was her own personal archive, a testament to a story she had never truly let go of. She flipped through pages, her eyes scanning old articles, police reports, witness statements. The official story was he left for college in the fall of '97. Martha said, her voice thoughtful. But I remember a rumor. Something about him staying in town for a while, working odd jobs. Nothing concrete, just whispers. Then Martha found it. A small, almost illegible note scribbled in the margin of one of her articles, dated August 1998. It read, "TM, seen near Old Mill. Late nights." The Old Mill was a derelict building on the outskirts of Havenwood, a place teenagers sometimes went to drink or cause mischief, but also a place known for its isolation. It was close to the river, not far from the park where Sarah had vanished. Evelyn felt a cold dread spread through her. Thomas Miller, supposedly gone, yet seen near the old mill, weeks after Sarah disappeared. A place that was both secluded and crucially connected to the very landscape of Sarah's vanishing. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was more than a whisper. It was a first real suspicion, a chilling thread connecting a forgotten face in a yearbook to the gaping hole in Evelyn's life. The silence that had defined Sarah's absence for so long now felt like a deliberate act, a carefully constructed facade. And Evelyn, with Martha by her side, was finally ready to tear it down. Martha Jenkins's cottage, with its scent of old paper and forgotten stories, became Evelyn's new sanctuary, a place where the silence wasn't empty, but pregnant with possibility. The yellowed note TM, seen near Old Mill, late nights, was a fragile bridge across 25 years of silence, a whisper from a past that refused to stay buried. Martha, her eyes sharp behind her glasses, leaned back in her armchair, a thoughtful frown creasing her brow. The old mill, she murmured more to herself than to Evelyn, always a place for secrets. Kids used to sneak out there, sure. But Thomas Miller, he wasn't the type for teenage shenanigans. What was he then? Evelyn asked, her voice tight, with a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity. The image of Thomas's intense, unsmiling face from the yearbook flashed in her mind. He had always seemed so unremarkable, so forgettable. Now he felt like the key to everything. Martha tapped a finger on the old newspaper clipping. His family, the Millers. They were pillars of the community, quiet, devout. But there was always a shadow around Thomas. Nothing anyone could put a finger on, just a feeling. He was too quiet, perhaps, too observant. She paused her gaze, distant, sifting through decades of small-town gossip and unspoken truths. The theory, the one that never made it into print, was that Thomas was involved in something illicit out at the mill. Nothing violent, mind you, just business. Something his family wouldn't have approved of. Maybe he was dealing or running some kind of small-time operation. That's why he left so suddenly, they said. To escape that life, to start fresh somewhere, no one knew his name. This was the first real theory Evelyn had heard that wasn't simply Sarah ran away. It was a plausible explanation for Thomas's abrupt departure, a convenient narrative that almost made sense. If Thomas was involved in something illegal and Sarah had stumbled upon it, perhaps he had simply silenced her. A desperate act to protect his secret, to protect his family's reputation. The thought was horrifying, yet it offered a twisted kind of logic, a path through the impenetrable fog of the unknown. It was a theory that promised to answer the mystery, but Evelyn felt a cold, unsettling certainty that it was too neat, too simple. It felt like a story designed to close the book, not truly open it. But why Sarah Evelyn pressed her voice barely a whisper? She wasn't involved in anything like that. She was innocent. Martha nodded slowly. That's the part that never fit. If it was just about the mill, why Sarah? Unless she saw something. Something more than just a transaction. Something that implicated someone else. Someone bigger. The conversation shifted, a new character emerging from the periphery of Havenwood's past, a man named Silas Thorne. Silas had been a drifter, a handyman who worked odd jobs around town in the late 90s, often seen near the old mill, scavenging for scrap metal. He was a man of few words, his eyes always darting as if expecting trouble. Martha remembered him because he had disappeared from Havenwood shortly after Sarah, almost as quietly as Thomas Miller. Silas was a strange one. Martha recalled her voice low. He had a reputation for being resourceful, and he knew the mill like the back of his hand, knew all its hidden nooks and crannies. Evelyn felt a jolt. The mill wasn't just a place. It was a labyrinth, a decaying monument to Havenwood's industrial past, filled with forgotten machinery and dark corners. If Thomas was involved in something there, Silas Thorne would have been his ghost, a silent witness to whatever transpired. The idea of Silas, a man who lived on the fringes being connected to Thomas, the son of a prominent family, introduced a new layer of complexity. A subtle contradiction to the simple Thomas was a small-time criminal theory. It hinted at a deeper, more intricate web, a story that was not what it seemed. The emotional pressure on Evelyn intensified. For 25 years, she had lived with the crushing weight of Sarah's absence, the unanswered questions a constant dull ache. Now, with each new piece of information, each new name, the ache sharpened into a terrifying anticipation. What if the truth was worse than she could ever imagine? What if it implicated people she knew, people she had trusted? The thought was a bitter pill, but the alternative, continued ignorance, was no longer an option. She had to know. She had to find Sarah, even if it was only the truth of what happened to her. Martha, sensing Evelyn's escalating turmoil, offered a practical suggestion. Silas Thorne had a sister, Clara. She moved to Asheville years ago. She might know something. She was fiercely protective of Silas, always worried about the company he kept. The next morning, Evelyn and Martha were on the road heading west towards Asheville, the mountains rising in hazy blue layers around them. The journey was long filled with a tense silence punctuated by the hum of the tires on the asphalt. Evelyn clutched the yearbook, Thomas Miller's face a constant unsettling presence. She thought of Sarah, her vibrant, hopeful daughter, and the life that had been stolen from her. The thought fueled her, pushing aside the fear, replacing it with a steely resolve. They found Clara Thorne in a small, cluttered apartment above a pottery studio. She was older now, her face lined with worry, but her eyes still held a flicker of her brother's guarded intensity. When Evelyn showed her the yearbook photo of Thomas Miller and mentioned the old mill, Clara's face paled. She looked from the photo to Evelyn, then to Martha, her gaze wary. "Why are you asking about Thomas Miller?" she asked, her voice raspy. "And Silas? That's old news." Evelyn explained, her voice, calm, measured, recounting Sarah's disappearance, the decades of silence, the sudden, inexplicable appearance of Thomas's face in the yearbook. She spoke of the note Martha had found, the whispers about the mill. Clara listened, her hands twisting a small clay bird, her eyes fixed on some distant point. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Silas. He was at the mill. A lot. Not for what people thought. Not for drugs. He was helping someone. Someone important. Someone who didn't want to be seen." Clara paused, her gaze meeting Evelyn's, and in her eyes, Evelyn saw not just fear, but a deep, abiding sorrow. Silas saw something that night. The night Sarah disappeared. He told me. He saw Thomas Miller and someone else. Someone from Havenwood. Someone everyone trusted. Clara's words hung in the air, a chilling revelation that shattered the convenient theory of a simple, illicit operation. It wasn't just Thomas. It was someone else. Someone from Havenwood. Someone trusted. The implication was a punch to Evelyn's gut, a betrayal that went far deeper than she had ever imagined. The silence that had enveloped Sarah's disappearance for 25 years now felt less like a void and more like a carefully constructed wall built by powerful hands. And behind that wall, a truth far more terrifying than a runaway or even a simple crime. Clara's eyes, wide and haunted, held a secret that was about to unravel everything. Clara Thorne's words hung in the air, thick with the weight of decades of unspoken fear. Silas. He saw Thomas Miller. And someone else. Someone from Havenwood. Someone everyone trusted. The small clay bird in Clara's hands lay forgotten, her knuckles white as she gripped it. Her eyes, wide and haunted, were fixed on Evelyn, as if passing a terrible burden. Evelyn felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Not a runaway. Not a random act. Not even a desperate criminal trying to cover his tracks. This was a betrayal. A calculated, insidious act by someone woven into the very fabric of Havenwood, someone who had walked among them, offered condolences, perhaps even attended Sarah's memorial. The thought was a poison seeping into every corner of her mind, corrupting every memory of her hometown. The simpler, almost convenient theory of Thomas Miller as a lone, desperate figure involved in some petty crime at the mill shattered into 1,000 pieces. This was bigger. This was a conspiracy. A deep, festering wound at the heart of their quiet community. Who, Evelyn whispered, the single word raw, torn from her throat. Who was it, Clara? Clara flinched her gaze, darting to Martha, then back to Evelyn. Silas. He was scared. He said this person. They had power, influence. They could make things disappear. People. Truths. She took a shaky breath, her voice barely audible. He said this person was at the mill that night, with Thomas. And they were talking about Sarah, about what she knew. The revelation was a punch to Evelyn's gut, stealing her breath. Sarah knew something. This wasn't random. This wasn't a tragic accident. Sarah had been silenced, and the person responsible wasn't a stranger, but someone from their own world. The emotional unraveling Evelyn had suppressed for years, the raw grief and unyielding questions now surged to the surface, amplified by this new, horrifying truth. Her hands trembled, her vision blurring with unshed tears. All those years of believing Sarah had simply vanished, of clinging to the slim hope she might return, were now replaced by the chilling certainty of a deliberate, calculated act. The betrayal was almost as agonizing as the loss itself. Martha, ever the journalist, leaned forward, her voice calm but insistent. Clara, what did Silas see? What did he hear? Who was this person? Clara closed her eyes, a shudder passing through her. He didn't tell me the name, not directly. He was too afraid. But he said this person had a distinctive way of speaking, a certain cadence. And he said they were talking about the bridge. Not the old rusted bridge by the mill, but another bridge. The one by the old Carrington property. The one that used to lead to the old hunting cabin. Evelyn's mind reeled. The old hunting cabin. Her grandfather's cabin. A place she and Sarah had visited countless times as a child, a place filled with happy memories of fishing trips and campfire stories. It was secluded deep in the woods, rarely used anymore, and the bridge leading to it was even more remote, a forgotten path. Why would anyone be talking about that bridge in connection to Sarah, unless, Silas said? Clara continued, her voice gaining a fragile strength, as if finally unburdening herself, that he saw them. Thomas and the other person, they were carrying something, wrapped in a tarp, and they were heading towards that bridge. towards the cabin, a secondary clue. Not a physical object, but a location, a destination whispered in fear and remembered across decades. The old hunting cabin. It was a place Evelyn had dismissed from her thoughts years ago, too remote, too disconnected from the park where Sarah had last been seen. But now, with Clara's words, a chilling new trail appeared. The bridge, the cabin, the tarp. The pieces once disparate began to click into place, forming a terrifying new picture. Martha's eyes widened. The Carrington cabin. But that's miles from the park. And the police searched the area around the park, the river. They wouldn't have gone that far, Evelyn said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Not without a reason. Not unless they were trying to hide something. Permanently. The implication was clear, horrifying. If Sarah had been taken to the cabin, then Clara nodded, tears finally spilling down her weathered cheeks. Silas said he heard them arguing. The other person was angry, saying Sarah was too curious, saying she knew too much. And then he heard a sound, like a muffled scream. And then silence, the silence that had haunted Evelyn for 25 years, the silence that had been the backdrop to her grief, was suddenly filled with the echo of that muffled scream. It was a sound she had never heard, yet it resonated deep within her, a primal confirmation of her worst fears. Sarah hadn't run away. She had been taken. And the person responsible was not only known to Havenwood, but had actively participated in a cover-up that had lasted for a quarter of a century. He said he saw them leave the cabin later that night. Clara added her voice, barely a whisper. Only 2 of them. And they weren't carrying anything. The image was stark brutal. 2 figures emerging from the darkness of the woods, leaving behind a secret buried deep. Evelyn felt a cold, hard resolve settle over her. The grief was still there, a constant companion, but now it was tempered by a burning need for justice. The person Clara described, the one with the certain cadence, the one who wielded power and influence in Havenwood, was still out there. And they had lived their lives free and unburdened, while Evelyn had suffered in a purgatory of unanswered questions. The cadence, Martha mused, her eyes narrowing. That's a detail. A very specific detail. She began to rummage through her old notes, pulling out transcripts of interviews, old town council meeting minutes, anything that might contain the voice of Havenwood's influential figures. Evelyn stood, her gaze fixed on the window, on the quiet, unassuming streets of Havenwood. The town that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a cage, its familiar faces suddenly suspect. The truth, when it finally emerged, would not just be about Sarah. It would be about the darkness that had festered beneath the surface of their idyllic community, a darkness protected by those everyone trusted. And Evelyn, armed with a faded yearbook photo and a terrified woman's confession, was ready to expose it, no matter the cost. The old hunting cabin, long forgotten now, beckoned a silent, chilling promise of the truth. Clara Thorne's apartment, once a place of quiet desperation, now hummed with the electric charge of a truth finally unearthed. The name, the location, the chilling implication of a muffled scream. It was a torrent that washed away 25 years of carefully constructed denial. Evelyn felt a profound, almost dizzying sense of vertigo. The world she thought she knew, the quiet, safe Havenwood of her memories, was a lie. It was a stage, and the people she had trusted were actors in a macabre play, their true faces hidden behind masks of respectability. The cadence, Martha repeated, her voice sharp, cutting through the haze of Evelyn's shock. She was already flipping through her old notebooks, her mind racing, connecting dots Evelyn hadn't even known existed. Silas said a certain cadence, a distinctive way of speaking. That's not just a detail, Evelyn. That's a fingerprint. Martha had interviewed everyone in Havenwood back then. The mayor, the sheriff, the pastor, prominent business owners. She had transcripts, recordings, memories of their voices, their mannerisms. The idea that someone from that inner circle, someone trusted, could be involved was a horrifying yet strangely liberating thought. It meant Sarah hadn't just vanished. She had been taken, and by someone who had the power to make her disappearance and their own involvement disappear too. This wasn't a simple criminal act. It was a calculated, deeply rooted cover-up implying a network of complicity or fear that extended far beyond Thomas Miller. The false theory that Thomas Miller was a lone small-time criminal whose illicit activities at the mill had somehow intersected with Sarah crumbled entirely. Clara's terrified confession painted a different picture. Thomas was a pawn, a terrified accomplice to someone far more influential, someone who could command silence and orchestrate a decades-long deception. Silas Thorne, a man who lived on the fringes, had seen the true face of power in Havenwood, and it had scared him into a quarter-century of silence. His fear, Clara explained, was not just of Thomas, but of the other person, the one who spoke with that chilling cadence, the one who had the authority to make threats that resonated with deadly seriousness. This revelation deepened the emotional fallout for Evelyn, transforming her grief into a burning righteous fury. The betrayal was a fresh wound, but it also fueled a relentless drive for justice. The bridge by the old Carrington property. Evelyn murmured the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. The hunting cabin. The cabin was a place of childhood innocence, a rustic retreat where Sarah had spent countless summer days fishing in the creek, exploring the woods, her laughter echoing through the trees. To think of it as a place of terror, a place where Sarah's vibrant life might have been extinguished, was almost unbearable. Yet the image of Thomas and the unknown figure carrying a tarp towards that secluded bridge, towards that cabin, was seared into her mind. It was a secondary clue, a chilling destination that now became their singular focus. We need to go there. Evelyn said, her voice firm, devoid of the tremor that had plagued her for so long. Now, Martha didn't argue. She saw the steel in Evelyn's eyes, the transformation from a grieving mother to a woman on a mission. The journalist in her recognized the gravity of the moment, the potential for a story that would shake Havenwood to its core. She grabbed her old camera, a relic from her reporting days, and a flashlight. The drive back to Havenwood felt different. The familiar roads, the sleepy houses, the distant mountains. They all seemed to hold a sinister secret, a silent complicity in the decades of lies. The air, once thick with honeysuckle, now felt heavy with unspoken truths. They drove past the town square, past the park, where Sarah had last been seen, a ghost of a red tassel still fluttering in Evelyn's memory. Then they turned onto a narrow, overgrown dirt road, barely more than a deer trail that wound deep into the woods towards the old Carrington property. The trees grew thicker here, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a canopy that blocked out the afternoon sun. The air grew cooler, damp with the scent of pine needles and decaying leaves. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of their tires on the gravel and the frantic beating of Evelyn's heart. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, every rustle in the undergrowth seemed to whisper Sarah's name. This was the landscape of her childhood, now transformed into a chilling crime scene, a place where innocence had been irrevocably lost. Finally, the road opened slightly, revealing the rusted skeletal remains of the old bridge. It was barely more than a few rotting planks spanning a shallow rocky creek, long abandoned, swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. Evelyn stopped the car. The bridge was exactly as Clara had described. Remote, forgotten, a perfect place for a secret. They got out the silence of the woods, pressing in on them. Evelyn pulled out her phone, its flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. Martha followed, her camera clutched tight. They crossed the rickety bridge, the old wood groaning under their weight, a mournful sound in the stillness. On the other side, a faint path, almost swallowed by undergrowth, led deeper into the woods. This was the path to the cabin. The cabin itself was a dilapidated shell, its windows broken, its porch sagging. The air inside was cold and stale, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Evelyn's flashlight beam swept across the single room, illuminating cobweb-draped furniture, a rusted wood stove, and a thin layer of dust covering everything. It was a place frozen in time, a silent witness to forgotten summers, and perhaps a terrible night. Then Evelyn saw it. Tucked away in a dark corner, half hidden beneath a pile of rotting firewood, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was open, its delicate chain broken. Evelyn's breath hitched. It was Sarah's. The locket she had worn every day since she was 10, the one Evelyn had given her grandmother. The one that had been missing from her jewelry box. Evelyn knelt, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. It was cold, heavy with the weight of its discovery. But it wasn't just the locket. Beneath it, partially obscured by the dirt and leaves, was something else. A small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was old, weathered, but Evelyn recognized it instantly. It was a carving her grandfather, a skilled woodworker, had made years ago, a unique piece he had given to a very specific person in Havenwood, a person of influence, a person everyone trusted. The wooden bird was a silent, undeniable confirmation of Clara's story, a chilling link to the someone else who had been at the mill, at the bridge, at the cabin. It was a piece of evidence that screamed of a deeper cover-up, a powerful figure in Havenwood who had orchestrated Sarah's disappearance and then lived a lie for 25 years. The silence in the cabin was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the deafening roar of a truth that had been buried alive, waiting for Evelyn to find it. The hunt for Sarah had just become a hunt for justice, and the target was far closer to home than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The small, intricately carved wooden bird felt impossibly light in Evelyn's hand, yet its weight was crushing. It was old, weathered, its smooth surface worn by time. But Evelyn knew it with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. Her grandfather, a man whose hands were as skilled with wood as his heart was, with kindness, had carved only a few of these, each one unique, a testament to his quiet artistry. And this one, this particular bird, with its distinctive, slightly tilted head, had been a gift. A gift to a man he deeply respected. A man Evelyn had deeply respected. Pastor John Albright. The name echoed in her mind, a thunderclap in the suffocating silence of the cabin. Pastor Albright, the spiritual shepherd of Havenwood, the man who had presided over every baptism, every wedding, every funeral in town for 40 years. The man who had held Evelyn's hand at Sarah's empty memorial service, his voice a soothing balm as he spoke of God's mysterious ways of faith in the face of the incomprehensible. His words delivered with that familiar, comforting cadence, a deep, resonant tone that filled the church and calmed troubled souls, now twisted into something grotesque, a chilling echo of Clara Thorne's terrified whisper, a certain cadence, someone everyone trusted. Evelyn's knees buckled. She sank to the dusty floor, the locket and the wooden bird clutched in her trembling hands. Disbelief warred with a sickening certainty. Pastor Albright. It was unthinkable. He was the embodiment of goodness, of moral rectitude in Havenwood. He had been a constant presence in Sarah's life, a gentle giant who always had a kind word, a warm smile. Sarah had sung in his choir, volunteered at his church youth groups. The very idea was a blasphemy, a violation of everything Evelyn held sacred. Yet the bird, the locket, the hidden cabin, Clara's fear-laced confession, they coalesced into an undeniable, horrifying truth. A wave of nausea washed over her, a visceral reaction to the profound betrayal. All those years, all those sermons about faith and hope, all those comforting words delivered with that familiar, reassuring voice while he knew. He knew what had happened to Sarah. He knew where she was. He had looked Evelyn in the eye, offered his condolences, and helped bury the truth along with her daughter's memory. The horror of it was not just the crime itself, but the insidious, calculated deception that had allowed it to fester for a quarter of a century, protected by the very institution meant to offer solace and moral guidance. A memory, sharp and painful, pierced through Evelyn's shock. It was the day after Sarah vanished. Pastor Albright had been at their house, his presence a quiet comfort amidst the chaos of the initial search. He had spoken to Officer Miller, his voice low and authoritative, suggesting that perhaps Sarah, being a bright, independent girl, might have simply needed to find her own path after graduation. He had subtly, almost imperceptibly reinforced the runaway narrative, lending it the weight of his moral authority. Evelyn remembered how Miller had seemed to defer to him, how the initial frantic search had quickly tapered off, replaced by a quiet, almost resigned acceptance of the official theory. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a deliberate act of misdirection, a carefully placed stone in the wall of silence that had entombed Sarah's truth. And Thomas Miller, the quiet, reclusive boy from the yearbook. Thomas, whose family was also deeply involved in the church, whose father was a deacon. It clicked into place with a sickening thud. Thomas wasn't just a random accomplice. He was likely under the pastor's influence, perhaps even coerced. The pastor, a figure of immense power and respect in their small, insular community, would have had a hold over a troubled youth like Thomas, a way to ensure his silence, to make him complicit in a crime that would otherwise be unthinkable. The note Silas Thorne had found, "You talk, you disappear," too now resonated with the chilling authority of a man who could make such threats a terrifying reality. Martha, who had been quietly observing Evelyn's unraveling, knelt beside her, her hand gently touching Evelyn's shoulder. She saw the locket, then the wooden bird. Her eyes, already sharp, widened in recognition. The Albright bird. She whispered, her voice laced with a similar horror. "Your grandfather made that for him, didn't he? For his 25th anniversary at the church." Evelyn could only nod, tears finally streaming down her face, not of grief, but of a searing, righteous anger. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and incomprehensible, now formed a complete, grotesque picture. Sarah hadn't run away. She had seen something connected to Pastor Albright, something so damning that he had orchestrated her disappearance using his influence and perhaps a terrified young man to bury the truth. The horror was compounded by the fact that this man, this pillar of their community, had then spent decades living a lie comforting the very family he had destroyed. The air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating with the weight of the revealed truth. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of a muffled scream, of a life brutally cut short, and of a betrayal that ran deeper than any Evelyn could have imagined. The satisfaction of finally knowing was intertwined with a profound soul-deep horror. The monster wasn't some faceless stranger. It was the man who had preached sermons of love and forgiveness from the pulpit, the man who had been a trusted confidant, a spiritual guide. Evelyn slowly rose, her body stiff, but her resolve hardening into a cold, unyielding steel. She looked at Martha, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "We have to expose him," she said, her voice raw but steady. "We have to tell everyone. For Sarah, for Havenwood, for every other secret he's buried." The long-delayed justice, once a distant, impossible dream, was now a tangible, terrifying imperative. The truth finally unearthed from the depths of the old hunting cabin was about to shatter the peace of Havenwood, exposing the darkness that had lurked beneath its idyllic surface for far too long. The wooden bird, a silent testament to a monstrous betrayal, felt like a brand in Evelyn's palm. Pastor John Albright. The name once synonymous with comfort and unwavering faith now tasted like ash of bitter poison in her mouth. The man who had cradled her hand, offered solace, and preached sermons of divine justice had for 25 years walked among them, a wolf in shepherd's clothing, his hands stained with Sarah's truth. The sheer audacity of his deception, the depth of his hypocrisy, was a physical blow, leaving Evelyn gasping for air in the stale, dust-filled cabin. She saw it all now with horrifying clarity. The subtle nudges towards the runaway theory, the quiet authority in his voice that had swayed Officer Miller, the way he had gently, almost imperceptibly, steered the narrative away from any deeper investigation. He hadn't just known. He had orchestrated. He had used his position, his unassailable reputation, to bury Sarah's memory beneath a mountain of lies, protecting himself, his church, and whatever dark secret Sarah had stumbled upon. The cadence of his voice, once so reassuring, now echoed in her mind, a chilling, insidious melody of deceit. Evelyn's grief, long a dull, constant ache, flared into a searing, righteous fury. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. This was about every comforting word he had ever uttered, every prayer he had led, every soul he had supposedly guided. It was a desecration, a profound violation of trust that extended far beyond her family, tainting the very moral fabric of Havenwood. The man who had promised salvation had delivered damnation, and he had done so with a smile. Martha, her face grim, understood. She had seen the wooden bird, recognized its significance, and the pieces of her own long-dormant suspicions were now locking into place. The silence in the cabin was broken only by Evelyn's ragged breaths, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them both. "We have to go to the police," Martha said, her voice low, practical. "We have to tell them everything. The locket, the bird, Clara's testimony." Evelyn shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "The police. The same police who believed him 25 years ago. The same police who let him bury Sarah's case under runaway." She looked at the locket, then at the wooden bird, then back at Martha. "This isn't enough. Not for him. He's too powerful, too trusted." She remembered the town's unwavering faith in Pastor Albright, the way his words were gospel, his presence a comforting anchor in their small community. To accuse him would be to tear at the very foundations of Havenwood, to shatter a collective illusion that had been carefully maintained for decades. There would be resistance denial, a fierce protectiveness of their spiritual leader. People would call her crazy, a grieving mother, finally succumbing to delusion. The moral weight of his position, the sheer unthinkability of his guilt, would be his shield. We need more. Evelyn stated, her voice gaining a steely resolve. We need something undeniable. Something that even Havenwood can't ignore. Her mind raced, fueled by a desperate, almost manic energy. If Pastor Albright was involved, if he had used the cabin, then there had to be more. More secrets, more evidence, more whispers from the past that he had tried to silence. The cabin itself, a silent witness, might hold further clues. And Thomas Miller. He was the key. He had been there. He knew. Thomas Miller. Evelyn set her eyes fixed on the wooden bird. He was with him. He saw everything. He's the one we need to find. Martha nodded, pulling out her phone. I'll start digging. See if I can find any trace of him. He disappeared off the map, but people don't just vanish without a ripple. Evelyn's gaze swept around the dilapidated cabin, her eyes now seeing it not as a place of childhood memories, but as a crime scene, a repository of buried truths. The dust, the decay, the silence, they were all part of the cover-up. She imagined Pastor Albright, his face impassive, his voice calm, orchestrating the terrible events of that night, then returning to his pulpit, his conscience seemingly unburdened. The thought was a fresh wave of nausea, but it also solidified her resolve. She would not rest until his true face was revealed. They spent hours meticulously searching the cabin, Evelyn driven by a desperate intuition, Martha by her journalistic tenacity. They found nothing more of immediate significance, no smoking gun, no hidden confession. But the locket and the wooden bird were enough to ignite the fire. They were the first cracks in the impenetrable wall of silence. As they drove back towards Havenwood, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the familiar landscape, Evelyn felt a profound shift within her. The passive grief, the quiet despair that had defined her life for 25 years had been replaced by a fierce, unyielding purpose. She was no longer just a mother mourning her lost child. She was an avenging angel armed with a terrible truth. The path ahead would be fraught with resistance, with denial, with the painful shattering of illusions. But for Sarah, for the vibrant, hopeful girl who had vanished on her graduation day, Evelyn would face it all. The confrontation was coming, and Havenwood, whether it was ready or not, was about to learn the true cost of its secrets. The drive back from the old hunting cabin was a silent, suffocating journey. The wooden bird, now wrapped carefully in a handkerchief, felt like a live thing in Evelyn's lap, its silent accusation burning through the fabric. Pastor John Albright. The name, once a source of comfort, now tasted like ash, a bitter, corrosive truth that threatened to consume her. The man who had stood at Sarah's empty memorial, his voice a balm, his eyes filled with a practiced sorrow, had been the architect of her daughter's disappearance, the keeper of a terrible secret. The sheer, unholy audacity of it twisted Evelyn's gut, a profound violation of trust that went beyond personal betrayal, tainting the very essence of faith and community. She saw him now, not as the benevolent shepherd, but as a master manipulator, his every comforting word, every gentle gesture a calculated performance. His distinctive cadence, that deep resonant tone that had once filled the church with a sense of peace, now echoed in her mind as the chilling voice Clara Thorne had described the voice of power and threat. He had used his unassailable position, his moral authority, to weave a narrative of a runaway, a convenient lie that allowed Havenwood to turn a blind eye, to forget to move on. And for 25 years, he had succeeded. "We can't just go to the police." Martha Evelyn said, her voice hoarse, breaking the heavy silence in the car. "Not yet. They'll dismiss it. They'll protect him. He's Pastor Albright. He's untouchable." Martha nodded, her jaw tight. "You're right. His influence runs deep. Deeper than any small-town police force. We need to hit him where it hurts. We need to expose him to the world, not just Havenwood." The plan began to form in the quiet intensity of Martha's living room. Martha, with her decades of journalistic experience, knew how to build a case, how to present facts that couldn't be ignored. She began by meticulously documenting everything: the locket, the wooden bird, Clara Thorne's full tearful testimony, which Martha recorded with a small, discreet device. They cross-referenced old town records, church ledgers, anything that might show Pastor Albright's movements, his connections, any subtle inconsistencies that in retrospect would scream of deceit. They looked for any mention of Thomas Miller, any hint of his continued presence in Havenwood after his supposed departure. The goal was not just to accuse, but to present an undeniable, irrefutable narrative that would shatter his carefully constructed facade. The decision was made to release the information online to a platform that would ensure it reached beyond the insular confines of Havenwood, a digital megaphone that would bypass local gatekeepers and traditional media outlets that might be too intimidated to challenge a figure like Albright. Martha, with Evelyn's input, crafted a compelling, emotionally charged account, weaving together the story of Sarah's vanishing, the decades of unanswered questions, the shocking discovery of the locket and the bird, and Clara's terrifying confession. They included the chilling detail of Albright's distinctive cadence, a detail that would resonate with anyone who had ever heard him speak. The narrative was raw, unflinching, designed to shock and to stir a collective conscience. It was a story of profound betrayal, of a community's trust exploited, and of a mother's relentless, decades-long search for truth. The day they uploaded it, Evelyn felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. It was a leap into the unknown, a direct challenge to the most powerful man in their town. The initial hours were agonizing. Silence. Then a trickle of comments, disbelief, outrage, fierce defense of Pastor Albright. "This is slander. How dare you accuse a man of God? Evelyn Carrington is clearly unhinged with grief." The resistance was immediate, visceral, exactly as Evelyn had predicted. The town rallied around its spiritual leader, unwilling to believe that the man who had baptized their children and buried their dead could be capable of such darkness. But then the tide began to turn. Martha had sent anonymous tips to larger independent true crime blogs and online forums, places where skepticism of authority and a hunger for justice ran deep. The story, with its shocking accusations against a beloved pastor, went viral. The locket and the wooden bird, photographed in stark detail, became undeniable symbols. Clara Thorne's recorded testimony, her voice trembling with fear, but unwavering in its account, was transcribed and shared, her words painting a chilling picture of Thomas Miller and the unnamed, powerful figure at the cabin. And then the comments began to shift. "I always thought Thomas Miller was a bit off. Pastor Albright's sermons. He always had a way of making you feel like you had to believe him. I remember hearing whispers about the old mill, but no one ever talked about it. Others, emboldened by the online anonymity, began to share their own small, unsettling memories, tiny pieces of a puzzle that, when put together, began to form a disturbing pattern. People who had gone to Havenwood High with Thomas Miller remembered him staying in town longer than the official story claimed. Others recalled strange, hushed conversations or moments where Pastor Albright's authority had felt less like guidance and more like control. The collective denial of Havenwood, carefully maintained for 25 years, began to crack under the relentless pressure of a truth that refused to stay buried. The local police, initially dismissive, found themselves inundated with calls not just from Havenwood residents, but from national media outlets. The story was too big, too sensational, too deeply unsettling to ignore. The pressure mounted, forcing their hand. A new younger detective, unfamiliar with the old loyalties and the ingrained respect for Pastor Albright, was assigned to the case. He listened to Clara's testimony, examined the evidence from the cabin, and with a grim expression, reopened Sarah Carrington's file. The label "Runaway," unresolved, was finally irrevocably changed. Evelyn watched it unfold from her quiet home, the screen of her computer a window into the maelstrom she had unleashed. The comments, the news reports, the frantic calls from reporters. It was overwhelming, exhausting. But beneath the exhaustion, a profound sense of grim satisfaction settled in her heart. She had stared into the face of the monster, the man who had stolen her daughter, and then gaslit an entire town, and she had refused to be silenced. She had buried her grief for 25 years, but now she was burying his lies. The moral weight of her actions was immense, the shattering of Havenwood's peace, a heavy burden, but the alternative, continued silence, continued injustice, was unthinkable. The next day, a patrol car pulled up to Pastor Albright's stately parsonage. The sight of it stark against the manicured lawn sent a ripple of shock through the town. Evelyn watched from her window, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. It wasn't over. Not yet. But the silence that had defined Sarah's absence, the silence that had been a lie, was finally irrevocably broken. The long-delayed justice, a flickering ember for so long, was now a roaring fire threatening to consume everything in its path. The wooden bird clutched in Evelyn's hand felt like a burning coal searing through the thin fabric of her remaining composure. Pastor John Albright. The name, once a sanctuary, was now a curse, a chilling echo of the betrayal that had festered in Havenwood for 25 years. The drive back from the cabin was a blur. The familiar landscape of rolling hills and sleepy farmhouses now appearing sinister, complicit in the decades of lies. Evelyn's mind raced a whirlwind of fragmented memories and horrifying realizations, each one a fresh stab of pain. She saw him not as the benevolent shepherd, but as a puppeteer, pulling strings, orchestrating a monstrous deception, his comforting cadence a tool of manipulation. Back in Martha's cluttered living room, the locket and the wooden bird lay on the coffee table, stark against the worn wood, undeniable proof. Clara Thorne, her face pale and drawn, had repeated her testimony, her voice trembling, but firm, her fear finally outweighed by the need for truth. She spoke of Silas's terror of the other person at the mill, at the bridge, at the cabin, the one with the voice of authority, the one who could make threats that resonated with deadly seriousness. The pieces were all there, forming a picture so grotesque, so unthinkable, that it threatened to shatter Evelyn's sanity. He'll deny it, Evelyn said, her voice, flat, devoid of emotion, staring at the wooden bird. He'll use his position, his influence. He'll turn the town against us. She knew Havenwood. She knew its deep-seated reverence for Pastor Albright, the way his words were gospel, his presence, an unshakable anchor in their small community. To accuse him would be to tear at the very fabric of their collective illusion, to shatter a peace built on a quarter-century of lies. The resistance would be fierce, the denial absolute. Martha, however, was already moving, her journalistic instincts kicking in. He can deny all he wants, Evelyn, but facts are stubborn things. And we have facts. We have a witness. And we have a story that will resonate far beyond Havenwood. She began to make calls discreetly at first, to contacts in larger news organizations, to independent true crime podcasters, and online forums, places where the hunger for justice often outweighed local loyalties. She knew that to expose a figure like Albright, they needed to bypass the traditional gatekeepers to create a groundswell of public pressure that even the most entrenched institutions couldn't ignore. The narrative they crafted was raw, unflinching, a meticulous reconstruction of Sarah's last day, interwoven with the decades of Evelyn's silent suffering, the shocking discovery of the yearbook photo, the terrifying confession from Clara, and the undeniable evidence found in the cabin. They included the chilling detail of Albright's distinctive cadence, a detail that would resonate with anyone who had ever heard him speak, transforming a comforting familiarity into a mark of sinister intent. It was a story designed to shock, to outrage, to stir a collective conscience that had been lulled into complacency for far too long. The initial response was exactly as Evelyn had predicted. A torrent of disbelief, outrage, and fierce defense of Pastor Albright flooded the online comment sections. "This is slander. How dare you accuse a man of God? Evelyn Carrington is clearly unhinged with grief-seeking attention." The town rallied around its spiritual leader, unwilling to believe that the man who had baptized their children and buried their dead could be capable of such darkness. The moral weight of his position, the sheer unthinkability of his guilt, was his most formidable shield. But then the tide began to turn. The story, with its shocking accusations against a beloved pastor, went viral. The locket and the wooden bird, photographed in stark detail, became undeniable symbols circulating across social media. Clara Thorne's recorded testimony, her voice trembling with fear, but unwavering in its account, was transcribed and shared, her words painting a chilling picture of Thomas Miller and the unnamed powerful figure at the cabin. The sheer improbability of such a clue surfacing decades later, and the profound personal impact it had on Evelyn, amplified the tabloid-like feel, not through gratuitous sensationalism, but through the heightened human drama and the audacity of the revelation. Emboldened by the online anonymity, others began to share their own small, unsettling memories, tiny pieces of a puzzle that, when put together, began to form a disturbing pattern. People who had gone to Havenwood High with Thomas Miller remembered him staying in town longer than the official story claimed. Others recalled strange, hushed conversations or moments where Pastor Albright's authority had felt less like guidance and more like control. The collective denial of Havenwood, carefully maintained for 25 years, began to crack under the relentless pressure of a truth that refused to stay buried. The narrative of crime, once neatly packaged as a runaway, was being systematically dismantled, replaced by a new, more complex, and infinitely more disturbing reality. The local police, initially dismissive, found themselves inundated with calls not just from Havenwood residents, but from national media outlets. The story was too big, too sensational, too deeply unsettling to ignore. The pressure mounted, forcing their hand. A new younger detective, unfamiliar with the old loyalties and the ingrained respect for Pastor Albright, was assigned to the case. He listened to Clara's testimony, examined the evidence from the cabin, and with a grim expression reopened Sarah Carrington's file. The label "Runaway," unresolved, was finally irrevocably changed. Evelyn watched it all unfold from her quiet home, the screen of her computer, a window into the maelstrom she had unleashed. The comments, the news reports, the frantic calls from reporters. It was overwhelming, exhausting. But beneath the exhaustion, a profound sense of grim satisfaction settled in her heart. She had stared into the face of the monster, the man who had stolen her daughter and then gaslit an entire town, and she had refused to be silenced. She had buried her grief for 25 years, but now she was burying his lies. The moral weight of her actions was immense, the shattering of Havenwood's peace a heavy burden. But the alternative, continued silence, continued injustice, was unthinkable. The next day, a patrol car pulled up to Pastor Albright's stately parsonage. The sight of it, stark against the manicured lawn, sent a ripple of shock through the town. Evelyn watched from her window, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. It wasn't over. Not yet. But the silence that had defined Sarah's absence, the silence that had been a lie, was finally irrevocably broken. The long-delayed justice, a flickering ember for so long, was now a roaring fire threatening to consume everything in its path. The confrontation had begun, not with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless drip of truth eroding the stone of deceit one drop at a time. The patrol car, a stark black and white, against the manicured green of Pastor Albright's parsonage lawn, was a silent explosion in the heart of Havenwood. Its flashing blue lights, though muted by the morning sun, pulsed with an undeniable urgency, a visual siren call that shattered the town's carefully maintained illusion of peace. Neighbors, drawn by the unusual sight, emerged from their homes, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dawning dread. Whispers rippled through the quiet streets, a frantic, disbelieving hum that quickly escalated into a cacophony of speculation. Pastor Albright. What could it possibly be about Pastor Albright? Evelyn watched from her living room window, a ghost in her own home, the wooden bird still clutched in her hand. The sight of the police at his door, the man who had preached comfort while orchestrating her daughter's disappearance, brought a grim, almost dizzying satisfaction. It was a moment she had dreamed of, prayed for 25 agonizing years. But it was also a moment fraught with peril, for she knew the depth of his influence, the unwavering faith Havenwood placed in its spiritual leader. This was not merely an arrest. It was a seismic shift threatening to crack the very foundations of their community. The initial confrontation was a masterclass in duplicity. Pastor Albright, impeccably dressed, his silver hair neatly combed, emerged from his parsonage, his face a picture of serene bewilderment. He greeted the young detective, a newcomer to Havenwood, with a gentle paternal smile, his voice that familiar resonant cadence filled with a practiced concern. "Officer, is there something I can help you with?" he inquired, his tone perfectly modulated, radiating an aura of unshakable integrity. He was the picture of a man unjustly accused, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the online storm that raged around his name. Evelyn and Martha arrived shortly after, summoned by the detective. The air in the parsonage living room was thick with unspoken tension. Pastor Albright's eyes, when they met Evelyn's, held a fleeting flicker of something unreadable, surprise recognition, before settling into a mask of compassionate sorrow. "Evelyn, my dear," he said, his voice soft, "I heard about these distressing accusations. My heart aches for you truly. This renewed pain after all these years." He extended a hand as if to offer comfort, but Evelyn recoiled her gaze, unwavering, a silent accusation in her eyes. The detective, a man named Miller, no relation to the retired officer, laid out the evidence: the locket, the wooden bird, Clara Thorne's recorded testimony. He spoke of the old hunting cabin, the bridge, the whispers of a hidden truth. Pastor Albright listened, his head tilted slightly, his expression one of profound sadness, occasionally interjecting with a gentle sigh or a shake of his head. "A tragic misunderstanding, officer," he murmured, his voice laced with a sorrow that seemed almost genuine. "A grieving mother, understandably distraught, clinging to desperate theories. And poor Clara, a troubled soul prone to flights of fancy." Then Evelyn spoke, her voice raw, stripped bare of 25 years of polite silence. "You know, Pastor," she began, her eyes fixed on his Sarah, "loved that locket. She wore it every day. And my grandfather, he carved that bird for you. A symbol of trust," he said, "a symbol of your unwavering faith." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with their unspoken meaning. "You stood at her memorial, Pastor. You looked me in the eye. You told me God had a plan. All the while you knew. You knew where she was. You knew what happened." Albright's composure wavered, a flicker of something dark in his eyes, quickly masked. "Evelyn, please," he said, his voice rising slightly, a hint of steel beneath the velvet. "Your grief is understandable, but these are grave accusations. Accusations against a man who has dedicated his life to God and to this community. I have nothing but compassion for your suffering, but I cannot allow such baseless slander to stand." He turned to the detective, his voice regaining its authority. "Officer, I assure you, I have no knowledge of any of this. My heart breaks for Mrs. Carrington, but her pain has clearly led her astray." The confrontation was a battle of wills, a clash between raw, unvarnished truth and meticulously crafted deception. Albright, the master of narrative, immediately began to construct his counterstory: Evelyn, a heartbroken mother, driven to delusion by grief; Clara, an unreliable witness, prone to exaggeration. He painted himself as the victim, a man of God, unjustly targeted, his reputation under attack. He spoke of his decades of service, his unwavering commitment to Havenwood, subtly reminding the detective of his unassailable standing in the community. Outside, the town was already choosing sides. The online world, initially swayed by Evelyn's compelling narrative, now fractured. Fierce defenders of Pastor Albright, many of them longtime parishioners, flooded social media with messages of support, condemning Evelyn and Martha as malicious, attention-seeking, or simply mad with grief. "How dare they attack our pastor? He's a saint. This is a witch hunt." The collective denial was a powerful force, a desperate clinging to the comforting illusion of their benevolent leader. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. The sheer volume of the online discussion, the undeniable evidence of the locket and the bird, the chilling consistency of Clara's testimony, it was too much for some to ignore. Whispers began to circulate, quiet questions that had been suppressed for years. Remember how quickly the police dropped the case. Remember how the pastor always seemed to be everywhere, knowing everything. The younger generation, less bound by the old loyalties, more accustomed to questioning authority, began to dig to cross-reference, to scrutinize Albright's past sermons, his public appearances searching for that certain cadence, that subtle hint of control. The shift in public opinion was slow, agonizingly so, but it was happening. The town was no longer a monolithic entity. It was a battleground, divided by a truth too terrible to fully comprehend. The moral weight of this confrontation pressed down on Evelyn. She was not just seeking justice for Sarah. She was tearing apart the very fabric of Havenwood, exposing the rot beneath its idyllic surface. Friendships would be shattered. Families' divided faith irrevocably shaken. But the alternative, allowing Albright to continue his charade to live a life of unburdened freedom, while Sarah lay buried in a forgotten secret, was a betrayal of a different, far deeper kind. The detective, caught between the town's fierce loyalty and the mounting evidence, found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't ignore the online storm, the national media attention that was now descending on Havenwood. He couldn't dismiss the physical evidence, however circumstantial it might seem to a jury. He had to act. Pastor Albright was not arrested that day. Not yet. But he was taken to the station for further questioning, his serene facade finally cracking under the relentless pressure. As he was led away, his gaze met Evelyn's one last time. In his eyes she saw not just anger, but a chilling, almost imperceptible flicker of fear. It was a small victory, a single crack in the impenetrable wall he had built. But it was enough. The battle for truth had just begun, and Evelyn, armed with a mother's unwavering love and a journalist's relentless pursuit, was ready to fight it to the bitter end. The long-delayed climax was finally in motion, and Havenwood was about to witness its own painful reckoning. The news of Pastor John Albright being taken for questioning ripped through Havenwood like a wildfire, consuming the last vestiges of its quiet, idyllic facade. The initial shock quickly curdled into a furious defensive roar. This wasn't just an accusation. It was an assault on their collective identity, a direct challenge to the moral compass of their small, insular world. How dare anyone suggest such a thing about Pastor Albright, the man who had guided them through every joy and sorrow for decades? Evelyn watched it unfold from a distance, the digital world, a chaotic mirror, to the turmoil in her own heart. Social media, once a tool for connection, became a battleground. Her name, Martha's name, were dragged through the mud, branded with accusations of slander, delusion, and a desperate attention-seeking grief. Parishioners, their faith fiercely protective, flooded online forums with testimonials of Albright's unwavering goodness, his tireless service, his profound compassion. "He's a saint," they cried. "This is a witch hunt. A grieving woman gone mad." The collective denial was a formidable, almost impenetrable wall, built brick by brick with decades of trust and reverence. But Evelyn, hardened by 25 years of unanswered questions and the crushing weight of Sarah's absence, felt a grim satisfaction. This was the resistance she had anticipated, the inevitable backlash when a deeply embedded lie was finally challenged. She understood the psychological impact of such a betrayal on a community, the profound discomfort of having to confront the possibility that someone they had implicitly trusted, someone who had shaped their moral landscape, was capable of such darkness. It was easier, far easier, to believe her mad than to accept the horrifying truth. Yet the relentless pressure from outside Havenwood began to chip away at that wall. Martha's strategic leaks to national true crime platforms had ignited a firestorm that local loyalties couldn't extinguish. The story of the vanished girl, the decades-long silence, the shocking discovery of the locket and the wooden bird, and Clara Thorne's terrified confession. It was a narrative too compelling, too deeply unsettling to be dismissed as mere delusion. The sheer audacity of the accusation against a beloved pastor, combined with the tangible evidence, created a tabloid-like intensity that transcended the usual boundaries of small-town gossip. The young detective Miller found himself caught in the eye of the storm. He was a man of facts, not faith, and the mounting evidence coupled with the relentless media scrutiny forced his hand. He couldn't ignore the inconsistencies, the long-buried whispers that were now screaming from the internet. The initial questioning of Pastor Albright had been a tense, drawn-out affair. Albright, ever the performer, had maintained his composure, his voice calm, his denials unwavering, painting himself as a victim of a cruel misunderstanding. He had subtly, expertly tried to reframe the narrative, to discredit Evelyn and Clara, to reinforce the image of himself as the wronged man of God. But the detective had seen the flicker in Albright's eyes, the momentary crack in his serene facade when confronted with the wooden bird, a piece of evidence so intimately tied to his own history, so undeniably placed. He had also noted the subtle shifts in Albright's story, the carefully chosen words that under scrutiny began to unravel. The investigation, once a stagnant pond, was now a rapidly flowing river, pulling in new resources, new perspectives. Detectives from the state police were brought in their presence a clear signal that this was no longer a local matter. They began to re-interview old witnesses, to re-examine dusty files, to look for the threads that had been deliberately cut 25 years ago. The moral weight of what Evelyn had unleashed pressed down on her heavy and constant. She knew that Havenwood would never be the same. The illusion of safety, the comforting belief that evil existed only outside their town, was shattered. Friendships were strained, families divided, and the very concept of trust, particularly in figures of authority, was irrevocably damaged. The betrayal trauma, once a personal agony, was now a communal wound, raw and exposed. Yet amidst the chaos, Evelyn felt a strange, quiet strength. She was no longer alone in her grief, no longer isolated in her search for truth. The online community, the national media, the new, uncompromised investigators, they were all part of her fight now. The long-delayed climax, the moment of reckoning, was not a single event, but a series of escalating confrontations, each one chipping away at Albright's carefully constructed empire of lies. The town, once united in its denial, was now forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that their beloved pastor might be a monster, and that their collective silence had allowed a terrible injustice to fester for far too long. The truth, like a relentless tide, was rising, threatening to drown the secrets of Havenwood, one painful revelation at a time. The next step was clear: the search for Thomas Miller, the terrified accomplice, the one who held the key to unlocking the full, horrifying story. The news of Pastor John Albright's questioning, initially met with furious denial, had begun to fracture Havenwood. The online world, a relentless, unforgiving mirror, reflected the town's internal struggle, a painful tug-of-war between ingrained loyalty and dawning horrifying suspicion. Evelyn, though exhausted by the relentless onslaught of public opinion, felt a grim satisfaction. The wall of silence was cracking. But to truly bring Albright down, they needed more than circumstantial evidence and a terrified witness. They needed Thomas Miller. Thomas had vanished from Havenwood's collective memory almost as completely as Sarah. The official story was that he'd gone to college, then disappeared into the anonymity of a big city. But Martha, with her decades of journalistic tenacity, knew that no one truly vanished without a trace, especially not someone with a secret as heavy as Thomas's. She worked tirelessly, sifting through old school records, cross-referencing distant relatives, tracing faint digital footprints left in the nascent days of the internet. It was a painstaking, often frustrating process, a slow, methodical chipping away at decades of carefully constructed obscurity. Weeks turned into a month. The pressure on the Havenwood police, now bolstered by state investigators, intensified. Pastor Albright, released on bail, maintained his serene facade, continuing to preach his sermons, now subtly laced with themes of persecution and unwavering faith in the face of adversity. His loyal parishioners rallied around him, creating a human shield of denial, but the cracks were widening. The national media, sensing a story of profound hypocrisy and small-town corruption, descended on Havenwood, their cameras and microphones amplifying every whisper, every doubt. Then a breakthrough. A faded address in a dusty alumni directory. A distant cousin's offhand remark, a forgotten social media profile. Martha found him. Thomas Miller. Living a quiet, almost reclusive life in a small coastal town in Oregon, working at a dusty independent bookstore. He was a ghost, haunting the shelves of forgotten stories, his own past a narrative he had desperately tried to erase. Evelyn and Martha flew to Oregon, the journey a blur of anxious anticipation. The air in the bookstore was thick with the scent of old paper and quiet desperation. Thomas Miller, now in his mid-40s, was gaunt, his face lined beyond his years, his dark eyes still holding that unsettling intensity Evelyn remembered from the yearbook photo. He looked up from behind the counter, and his gaze, when it met Evelyn's, held a flicker of recognition, then pure, unadulterated terror. He knew. He knew why they were there. He tried to deny it, of course. His voice was a reedy whisper, barely audible above the rustle of turning pages. I don't know what you're talking about. I left Havenwood right after high school. I don't know anything about Sarah Carrington. He stammered, his hands trembling as he rearranged a stack of novels, his eyes darting towards the back exit. He was a man living under the crushing weight of a secret, a prisoner of his own past, terrified that the long-buried truth would finally consume him. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice soft but firm, cutting through his frantic denials. "Thomas," she said, holding up the silver locket. "This was Sarah's. We found it in the old hunting cabin. And we know you were there." With Pastor Albright, the name spoken aloud seemed to drain all the color from his face. He sagged against the counter, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The fight, the decades-long struggle to keep the truth buried, finally left him. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes filled with a profound, agonizing sorrow, and then slowly he began to speak. His confession was a torrent, a dam breaking after 25 years of agonizing silence. He spoke of Pastor Albright's insidious influence, how the pastor had taken a troubled, impressionable young man under his wing, offering guidance, a sense of belonging, subtly twisting his faith into a tool of manipulation. Thomas had been drawn into a dark, unspoken world, a world of favors for the pastor's small acts of discretion that gradually escalated into something far more sinister. The night Sarah vanished, Thomas had been at the old mill doing one of Albright's favors, moving some illicit, untaxed liquor the pastor was secretly selling to supplement church funds. It was a small-time operation, but one that Albright guarded fiercely, fearing any scandal that could tarnish his image. Sarah Thomas, revealed, had stumbled upon it. She had been cutting through the woods, taking a shortcut home after graduation, and had seen Thomas and Albright, their faces illuminated by the dim light of a lantern, loading crates into a hidden compartment at the mill. She hadn't understood what she was seeing, not fully, but she had recognized Albright, and she had been curious. Too curious. Albright, ever the quick thinker, had approached her, his voice calm, reassuring, inviting her to the cabin for a private word to explain away what she had seen. Thomas, terrified, had followed a silent, unwilling witness. At the cabin, Albright had tried to reason with Sarah to make her promise silence to appeal to her loyalty to the church. But Sarah Thomas said had been defiant. She had seen the hypocrisy, the betrayal of trust, and she had threatened to tell her parents to tell everyone. She was going to expose him. That's when Albright's serene facade had cracked. His voice, usually so controlled, had risen in a furious, desperate whisper. He had grabbed Sarah, silencing her struggles, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, unholy rage. Thomas described the muffled scream, the sickening thud, the sudden, terrifying silence that followed. He had been paralyzed by fear, a young man caught in a nightmare, orchestrated by the very man he had been taught to revere. Albright, his face a mask of cold calculation, had then forced Thomas to help him. They had wrapped Sarah's body in a tarp, carried her through the dark woods, across the old bridge, and buried her in a shallow grave near the creek, a place so remote, so overgrown, that no one would ever think to look. He told me, Thomas whispered, his voice cracking, that if I ever spoke a word, he would destroy my family. He would say, I was the one who did it. He said he had enough influence to make sure no one would ever believe me. He said he would make me disappear, just like Sarah. The fear had been absolute, paralyzing. Thomas had fled Havenwood the next day, haunted by Sarah's ghost, living a life of quiet penance, forever looking over his shoulder, a victim of Albright's chilling power and manipulation. The note Silas Thorne had found, "You talk, you disappear too," was Albright's chilling promise, a constant reminder of the fate that awaited anyone who dared to challenge him. Thomas's confession was the final devastating piece of the puzzle, shattering the last vestiges of Evelyn's denial. Sarah hadn't just vanished. She had been murdered, silenced by a man who had used his sacred position to conceal his crimes. The emotional unraveling was profound, a raw, visceral agony that tore through Evelyn's soul. The image of Sarah, defiant and brave, in her final moments, confronting the man who would take her life, was both heartbreaking and a source of fierce pride. Her daughter had died fighting for the truth. But Thomas's confession also revealed a new unexpected clue, a chilling detail that deepened the cover-up. Albright, he said, had been meticulous. Before they buried Sarah, he had removed something from her. Not the locket, which he had carelessly dropped, but a small leather-bound diary Sarah always carried. He said it had things in it. Thomas whispered, his eyes wide with remembered fear. Things about him, about other people. He burned it, right there in the cabin fireplace. Said it was evidence of sin, the diary. Sarah's private thoughts, her observations, her secrets. It was a new trail, a horrifying implication of a deeper, more extensive web of deceit, perhaps involving others in Havenwood. Others whose sins Albright had also covered up, using his power to maintain control. The burning of the diary wasn't just about Sarah. It was about protecting a network of secrets, a hidden darkness that extended far beyond the old mill and the hunting cabin. The story was not just about a single murder. It was about the systemic corruption of power, the insidious nature of betrayal, and the long, agonizing fight for truth in a town that had chosen to believe a lie. The real investigation, armed with Thomas Miller's confession, was finally about to begin. Thomas Miller's confession, delivered in the hushed, dusty confines of an Oregon bookstore, was a detonation. It ripped through the 25 years of silence, tearing away the carefully constructed lies that had entombed Sarah's truth. Evelyn listened, her body rigid, as he recounted the horrifying details: Albright's insidious manipulation, the secret liquor operation at the mill, Sarah's defiant courage, the muffled scream, the sickening thud, the shallow grave by the creek. Each word was a fresh wound, but also a searing, agonizing clarity. Sarah hadn't just vanished. She had been murdered, silenced by the very man who had preached solace from the pulpit. The emotional unraveling was profound, a raw, visceral agony that tore through Evelyn's soul. The image of Sarah, vibrant and full of life, confronting the man who would take it, was both heartbreaking and a source of fierce, unyielding pride. Her daughter had died fighting for the truth, and now Evelyn would finish that fight. Thomas, his confession, a torrent of long-suppressed terror and guilt, also revealed a chilling new detail: the burned diary. Albright, he said, had been meticulous, removing the small leather-bound book from Sarah's person before they buried her. He said it had things in it. Thomas whispered, his eyes wide with remembered fear. Things about him, about other people. He burned it, right there in the cabin fireplace. Said it was evidence of sin, the diary. Sarah's private thoughts, her observations, her secrets. It was a horrifying implication of a deeper, more extensive web of deceit, perhaps involving others in Havenwood, others whose sins Albright had also covered up, using his power to maintain control. The burning of the diary wasn't just about Sarah. It was about protecting a network of secrets, a hidden darkness that extended far beyond the old mill and the hunting cabin. This wasn't just a single murder. It was about the systemic corruption of power, the insidious nature of betrayal, and the long, agonizing fight for truth in a town that had chosen to believe a lie. Martha, ever the seasoned journalist, moved with a quiet, efficient urgency. She recorded Thomas's entire confession, his voice, though reedy and broken, providing the undeniable weight of an eyewitness account. The locket, the wooden bird, Clara's testimony, and now Thomas's harrowing narrative. The pieces were all there, forming a picture so grotesque, so unthinkable, that it would shatter Havenwood to its core. They returned to Havenwood, not with triumph, but with a grim, resolute purpose. The young detective Miller was waiting. He listened to Thomas's confession, his face growing grimmer with each chilling detail. The initial skepticism, born of decades of ingrained respect for Albright, evaporated, replaced by a cold professional fury. The state investigators already involved now descended on Havenwood in force. Sarah Carrington's case, once a dusty file marked runaway, unresolved, was now a full-blown murder investigation with Pastor John Albright at its center. The news of Thomas Miller's confession, leaked by Martha to national media outlets, exploded across the country. The story of the beloved pastor, the vanished teen, the decades-long cover-up, and the terrified accomplice living in exile captivated a nation hungry for justice. Havenwood, once a quiet, unassuming town, became a media circus. Satellite trucks lined the streets, Reporters swarmed the town square, their microphones thrust into the faces of bewildered, outraged, and increasingly divided residents. The town's reaction was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, a raw public display of betrayal trauma. Many, particularly Albright's longtime parishioners, clung fiercely to their denial. "It's a lie," they cried, their voices hoarse with outrage. "Thomas Miller is a troubled young man. He's being coerced. Our pastor is a man of God." They organized vigils, held prayer meetings, and flooded social media with messages of unwavering support for Albright branding Evelyn and Martha as malicious attention-seeking or simply mad with grief. The psychological discomfort of confronting such a profound betrayal, of having their trust so utterly violated by a figure they had revered, was too immense for many to bear. It was easier, far easier, to believe the accusers were lying than to accept the horrifying truth about their spiritual leader. But the relentless tide of evidence, amplified by the national media, began to erode the wall of denial. Thomas Miller's confession, detailed and consistent, resonated with a chilling authenticity. The locket, the wooden bird, Clara's testimony, these were tangible facts that couldn't be prayed away. Whispers that had been suppressed for years now became shouts. People began to remember Albright's subtle influence, his uncanny ability to control narratives, his quiet authority that had always felt less like guidance and more like a subtle form of coercion. The younger generation, less bound by old loyalties, more accustomed to questioning authority, began to scrutinize Albright's past sermons, his public appearances, searching for that certain cadence, that subtle hint of control that now seemed so sinister. The division in Havenwood was stark painful. Families were torn apart, friendships shattered. The illusion of safety, the comforting belief that evil existed only outside their town, was irrevocably shattered. The betrayal trauma, once Evelyn's solitary burden, was now a communal wound, raw and exposed. The town was no longer a monolithic entity. It was a battleground divided by a truth too terrible to fully comprehend. Pastor Albright, his serene facade finally cracking under the relentless pressure, continued to deny everything. His public appearances became less frequent, his sermons shorter, his voice, though still resonant, now tinged with a desperate edge. He dismissed Thomas Miller as a confused and troubled soul, a pawn in a malicious scheme to discredit him and his church. But the fear in his eyes, a fleeting flicker Evelyn had seen at their first confrontation, was now more pronounced, a cold, hard glint that betrayed his carefully constructed composure. The police, armed with Thomas's confession and the mounting public pressure, moved swiftly. They obtained a warrant, and a team of forensic investigators descended on the old hunting cabin. They meticulously combed the area, searching for any trace of Sarah, any corroborating evidence of Thomas's horrifying account. The ground near the creek, long undisturbed, was carefully excavated. The discovery came on a cold gray morning, weeks after Thomas's confession. A small skeletal hand emerging from the damp earth. Then more. Sarah. Her remains, 25 years after she vanished, were finally found. The news ripped through Havenwood, silencing the last vestiges of denial, replacing outrage with a profound collective grief. The confirmation was brutal, undeniable. Sarah hadn't run away. She had been murdered. And the man who had preached her eulogy, the man who had comforted her grieving mother, was her killer. Pastor John Albright was arrested that afternoon, not at his parsonage, but at the church, just moments before he was to deliver his Sunday sermon. The sight of him, led away in handcuffs, his face finally stripped bare of its composure, was a moment of chilling, bittersweet triumph for Evelyn. The long-delayed justice, a flickering ember for so long, was now a roaring inferno. The truth, unearthed from the depths of the old hunting cabin and spoken by a terrified accomplice, had finally consumed the lies that had protected a monster for a quarter of a century. Havenwood would never be the same. And Evelyn, her heart heavy with sorrow, but burning with a fierce, unyielding resolve, knew that Sarah could finally rest. The discovery of Sarah's remains, a small skeletal hand emerging from the damp earth near the forgotten creek, sent a shockwave through Havenwood that no one could deny. The news delivered by the grim-faced detective was a brutal, undeniable confirmation. Sarah hadn't run away. She had been murdered. And the man who had preached her eulogy, the man who had comforted her grieving mother, was her killer. The town, already fractured by the online storm and the relentless media scrutiny, finally broke. The initial roar of outrage and denial, the fierce defense of Pastor John Albright, evaporated, replaced by a profound collective gasp of horror and shame. The illusion of their idyllic, safe community, so carefully maintained for decades, shattered into a million pieces. People wept openly in the streets, not just for Sarah, but for the innocence they had lost, for the trust that had been so utterly, monstrously betrayed. The betrayal trauma, once Evelyn's solitary burden, now became a communal wound, raw and exposed, leaving a deep, festering scar on the soul of Havenwood. Evelyn watched it all from a quiet distance, her heart a complex tapestry of profound sorrow and a fierce, almost cold satisfaction. The tears she shed were for Sarah, for the vibrant, hopeful girl whose life had been so cruelly extinguished, whose final moments had been filled with terror and defiance. But there was also a chilling sense of vindication. The truth, buried for 25 years, had finally clawed its way to the surface, dragged into the light by her unwavering resolve and Thomas Miller's agonizing confession. Sarah could finally rest. Pastor Albright's arrest at the church moments before his Sunday sermon was a scene etched forever into Havenwood's memory. The sight of him, led away in handcuffs, his face finally stripped bare of its composure, revealing a flicker of raw fear beneath the mask of piety, was a moment of chilling, bittersweet triumph for Evelyn. The man who had wielded his sacred position as a shield, who had orchestrated a decades-long cover-up, was finally exposed. His voice, that once comforting cadence, now sounded hollow, a grotesque echo of the lies he had spun. The legal process began swiftly, relentlessly. Thomas Miller, granted immunity in exchange for his full cooperation, became the star witness for the prosecution. His testimony, delivered with a quiet, haunted sincerity, painted a chilling picture of Albright's insidious manipulation, the secret liquor operation, Sarah's defiance, and the brutal act that followed. He described the muffled scream, the sickening thud, the forced complicity in burying Sarah's body, and the terrifying threat that had driven him into 2 decades of self-imposed exile. His words, though painful, were a testament to Sarah's courage, her refusal to be silenced even in her final moments. Forensic teams, now unhampered by old loyalties, meticulously combed the old hunting cabin and the surrounding woods. They found corroborating evidence. Faint traces of Sarah's DNA, disturbed soil, consistent with a shallow grave, and chillingly, the faint, almost invisible scorch marks in the cabin's fireplace, remnants of the diary Albright had burned, a testament to the secrets Sarah had carried and the lengths Albright had gone to protect them. The evidence, once dismissed or overlooked, now screamed of a calculated, premeditated crime. The town grappled with the fallout, a collective nervous breakdown playing out in public. The church, Once the heart of Havenwood became a symbol of betrayal. Congregants, their faith shattered, wrestled with agonizing questions. How could they have been so blind? How could they have trusted him so implicitly? The anger initially directed at Evelyn and Martha now turned inward, a bitter self-recriminating guilt. Some clung to the last vestiges of denial, whispering about a conspiracy, a frame-up anything to avoid the unbearable truth. But most, faced with the undeniable evidence, began the painful process of reckoning, of dismantling the comforting lies they had lived with for so long. Evelyn, though exhausted, found herself in a new role. No longer just a grieving mother, she became a reluctant symbol of resilience, a voice for the voiceless. Reporters flocked to her, seeking her perspective, her pain, her unwavering resolve. She spoke of Sarah not as a victim, but as a vibrant, courageous girl who had dared to speak truth to power. She spoke of the insidious nature of betrayal, the way trust once broken could poison an entire community. She spoke of the long, agonizing wait for justice and the bittersweet relief of finally finding it. The trial of Pastor John Albright became a national spectacle, a searing indictment of power hypocrisy and the devastating cost of long-held secrets. The man who had once commanded unwavering respect now faced the cold, unyielding gaze of justice. Evelyn sat in the courtroom, every day her presence a silent, powerful reminder of the life he had stolen, the decades of suffering he had inflicted. The confrontation was not just in the courtroom. It was in the hearts of every person in Havenwood, a painful, necessary reckoning with the darkness that had festered beneath their idyllic surface. The silence that had defined Sarah's absence was finally irrevocably broken, replaced by the clamor of truth demanding accountability. The discovery of Sarah's remains a small skeletal hand emerging from the damp earth near the forgotten creek sent a shockwave through Havenwood that no one could deny. The news delivered by the grim-faced detective was a brutal, undeniable confirmation. Sarah hadn't run away. She had been murdered. And the man who had preached her eulogy, the man who had comforted her grieving mother, was her killer. The town already fractured by the online storm, and the relentless media scrutiny finally broke. The initial roar of outrage and denial, the fierce defense of Pastor John Albright, evaporated, replaced by a profound collective gasp of horror and shame. The illusion of their idyllic, safe community, so carefully maintained for decades, shattered into a million pieces. People wept openly in the streets, not just for Sarah, but for the innocence they had lost, for the trust that had been so utterly, monstrously betrayed. The betrayal trauma, once Evelyn's solitary burden, now became a communal wound, raw and exposed, leaving a deep, festering scar on the soul of Havenwood. Evelyn watched it all from a quiet distance, her heart a complex tapestry of profound sorrow and a fierce, almost cold satisfaction. The tears she shed were for Sarah, for the vibrant, hopeful girl whose life had been so cruelly extinguished, whose final moments had been filled with terror and defiance. But there was also a chilling sense of vindication. The truth buried for 25 years had finally clawed its way to the surface, dragged into the light by her unwavering resolve and Thomas Miller's agonizing confession. Sarah could finally rest. Pastor Albright's arrest at the church moments before his Sunday sermon was a scene etched forever into Havenwood's memory. The sight of him, led away in handcuffs, his face finally stripped bare of its composure, revealing a flicker of raw fear beneath the mask of piety, was a moment of chilling, bittersweet triumph for Evelyn. The man who had wielded his sacred position as a shield, who had orchestrated a decades-long cover-up, was finally exposed. His voice, that once comforting cadence, now sounded hollow, a grotesque echo of the lies he had spun. The legal process began swiftly, relentlessly. Thomas Miller, granted immunity in exchange for his full cooperation, became the star witness for the prosecution. His testimony, delivered with a quiet, haunted sincerity, painted a chilling picture of Albright's insidious manipulation, the secret liquor operation, Sarah's defiance, and the brutal act that followed. He described the muffled scream, the sickening thud, the forced complicity in burying Sarah's body, and the terrifying threat that had driven him into 2 decades of self-imposed exile. His words, though painful, were a testament to Sarah's courage, her refusal to be silenced even in her final moments. Forensic teams, now unhampered by old loyalties, meticulously combed the old hunting cabin and the surrounding woods. They found corroborating evidence, faint traces of Sarah's DNA, disturbed soil consistent with a shallow grave, and chillingly, the faint, almost invisible scorch marks in the cabin's fireplace, remnants of the diary. Albright had burned a testament to the secrets Sarah had carried, and the lengths Albright had gone to protect them. The evidence, once dismissed or overlooked, now screamed of a calculated, premeditated crime. The town grappled with the fallout, a collective nervous breakdown playing out in public. The church, once the heart of Havenwood, became a symbol of betrayal. Congregants, their faith shattered, wrestled with agonizing questions. How could they have been so blind? How could they have trusted him so implicitly? The anger, initially directed at Evelyn and Martha, now turned inward, a bitter, self-recriminating guilt. Some clung to the last vestiges of denial, whispering about a conspiracy, a frame-up, anything to avoid the unbearable truth. But most, faced with the undeniable evidence, began the painful process of reckoning, of dismantling the comforting lies they had lived with for so long. Evelyn, though exhausted, found herself in a new role. No longer just a grieving mother, she became a reluctant symbol of resilience, a voice for the voiceless. Reporters flocked to her, seeking her perspective, her pain, her unwavering resolve. She spoke of Sarah not as a victim, but as a vibrant, courageous girl who had dared to speak truth to power. She spoke of the insidious nature of betrayal, the way trust once broken could poison an entire community. She spoke of the long, agonizing wait for justice and the bittersweet relief of finally finding it. The trial of Pastor John Albright became a national spectacle, a searing indictment of power hypocrisy and the devastating cost of long-held secrets. The man who had once commanded unwavering respect now faced the cold, unyielding gaze of justice. Evelyn sat in the courtroom every day, her presence a silent, powerful reminder of the life he had stolen, the decades of suffering he had inflicted. The confrontation was not just in the courtroom. It was in the hearts of every person in Havenwood, a painful, necessary reckoning with the darkness that had festered beneath its idyllic surface. The silence that had defined Sarah's absence was finally irrevocably broken, replaced by the clamor of truth demanding accountability. The verdict, when it came, was swift and unanimous: guilty. Guilty of murder. Guilty of obstruction of justice. Guilty of a betrayal so profound it would forever scar the soul of Havenwood. Pastor John Albright, the once revered shepherd, was led away, his face a mask of defeat, his power stripped bare. The long-delayed justice, a flickering ember, for so long was now a roaring inferno, consuming the lies that had protected a monster for a quarter of a century. Havenwood would never be the same. And Evelyn, her heart heavy with sorrow, but burning with a fierce, unyielding resolve, knew that Sarah could finally rest. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, a sound of finality that sliced through the suffocating tension. Guilty. The word delivered by the foreman of the jury was a collective exhale, a ripple of gasps and hushed sobs that swept through the gallery. Pastor John Albright, once the unshakable pillar of Havenwood, stood motionless, his face finally stripped bare of its composure, a mask of stark, chilling defeat. The carefully constructed facade maintained for 25 years with such meticulous deceit had crumbled, revealing the monster beneath. Evelyn felt it not as a surge of triumph, but as a profound, heavy release. The crushing weight that had pressed down on her soul for a quarter of a century, the agonizing uncertainty, the gnawing doubt. It lifted, leaving behind a vast, echoing void. It wasn't joy. How could it be joy when Sarah was still gone? It was a different kind of peace, a cold, hard certainty that the truth, however brutal, had finally been acknowledged. Sarah's murderer, the man who had looked Evelyn in the eye and offered false comfort, would pay. The long-delayed justice, a flickering ember for so long, was now a roaring inferno, consuming the lies that had protected him. The sentencing came weeks later, a somber, almost anticlimactic affair compared to the explosive trial. The judge, his voice devoid of emotion, delivered the maximum sentence: life, without parole. Pastor John Albright, stripped of his title, his influence, his very identity, was led away a broken man. His once resonant voice, now a hollow whisper, swallowed by the sterile silence of the courtroom. His fall from grace was absolute, a chilling testament to the power of a truth finally unearthed. Havenwood, however, remained in turmoil. The verdict, while undeniable, had shattered the town's collective psyche. The church, once the heart of the community, stood as a stark, painful symbol of betrayal. Its pews, once filled with Albright's loyal congregants, were now largely empty, a testament to the profound crisis of faith that had gripped the town. The betrayal trauma, once Evelyn's solitary burden, had become a communal wound, raw and exposed. Many struggled to reconcile the benevolent shepherd they had known with the cold-blooded killer exposed in court. Some clung to the last vestiges of denial, whispering about a conspiracy, a frame-up, anything to avoid the unbearable truth. But most, faced with the undeniable evidence, began the painful process of reckoning, of dismantling the comforting lies they had lived with for so long. The illusion of safety, the comforting belief that evil existed only outside their town, was irrevocably shattered. For Evelyn, the closure was a complex, bittersweet tapestry. There was no neat ending, no sudden erasure of pain. The grief for a murdered child, especially one whose death was shrouded in such insidious betrayal, did not follow a predictable course. It was a prolonged, complicated mourning, a wound that would never fully heal. She still found herself, in quiet moments, replaying the details of that graduation day, the last glimpse of Sarah's bright red gown, the scent of honeysuckle thick on the air, forever intertwined with the dawning dread. The repetition compulsion of her trauma, the unconscious need to revisit the events, might shift in its intensity, but the memory, the loss remained. Yet something had changed. The silence that had defined Sarah's absence for so long, the silence that had been a lie, was finally irrevocably broken. Sarah's voice, silenced in the woods, had finally been heard, amplified by Thomas Miller's confession, by Martha's relentless journalism, and by Evelyn's unwavering love. Her story, once a whispered tragedy, was now a searing indictment, a cautionary tale etched into the very soul of Havenwood. In the park, where Sarah had last been seen, A small, unassuming memorial was erected, not a grand monument, but a simple stone bench beneath the ancient oak trees, engraved with Sarah's name and the dates of her short, vibrant life. No grand pronouncements, no accusations, just a quiet space for remembrance. Evelyn often visited sitting on the bench, feeling the sun on her face, listening to the rustle of leaves, a different kind of peace settling over her. She would bring a single red rose the color of Sarah's graduation gown and place it on the bench. One afternoon, as she sat there, a young mother with her daughter no older than Sarah had been when she vanished, approached the bench. The little girl, her eyes wide with curiosity, pointed to the engraving. "Mommy, who was Sarah?" she asked. Evelyn looked at the mother, then at the child, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. She was a girl who loved this town. Evelyn said, her voice soft, and she loved the truth. And it cost her everything. She paused, then added, her gaze sweeping across the park, across the town, that was slowly, painfully beginning to heal. But because of her, the truth finally came out. And now, no one can ever bury it again. The honeysuckle still bloomed in Havenwood, its scent a bittersweet reminder of a day that had promised so much and delivered such profound loss. But now, when Evelyn smelled it, it was no longer just the scent of dread. It was also the scent of justice hard won and long delayed. The river which had flowed silently past Sarah's hidden grave for 25 years continued its journey. But now, its waters carried the echoes of a truth that would never again be silenced.